All right, how's it going? Hope you guys are doing well. So this is something that I was super excited for. It kind of symbolizes the next generation, the OLED era, finally coming to desktop displays. And while the concept of using an OLED as a desktop display is not a foreign concept, but it was pretty limited recently to LG's TV lineup as a popular choice. Which has its quirks, there's still TVs, but it brought up a lot of questions like, is this really the future of gaming panels? And can this really make that big of a splash in the market? First of all,
it's about damn time.
So this is LG's first 45-inch OLED ultra-wide gaming monitor. And on paper, it's pretty stacked, but there are really four main headlining features that you have to consider before you can even have an idea if this is something that you're even into. So I've been using this display for the past couple of weeks now, and it's pretty clear that LG wanted to create a top-tier product for enthusiasts and push OLED into a desktop package. The only problem is it feels like a couple of the decisions that they made to get here are not going to sit that well with a lot of people. I'll get to that in just a moment. My first reaction was this thing is ridiculous. It's like something from years ago where you ask someone to envision the perfect gaming monitor and you time traveled into the future and pulled this thing out. It looks awesome. For context, the two displays that I primarily jump from are the 42-inch C2, and that's using a 4K 120Hz OLED panel, and I also use a 34-inch 165Hz ultra-wide IPS monitor. So this wasn't as remarkably insane like the Samsung Odyssey was, because that was frankly just a monstrosity, but this is more, if you can call a 45-inch curved OLED monitor, manageable or usable. Right when you sit in front of this, since the screen has an 800R curve, which might be a little bit too much for some people, but when you find that sweet spot, it feels like it's just surrounding you and enveloping you in an immersive experience. And that's even before you fire up a game. The whole panel offers you what feels like more vertical screen real estate than what I was used to with a traditional ultrawide. And then at the same time, it also checks a lot of the boxes for features you'd find with other top-of-the-line monitors, while adding to the foundation of using OLED as its panel technology. And just for reference, this camera does not do this monitor justice whatsoever. The build quality feels premium. It's not using flimsy plastic bezels. The stand is aluminum. They thankfully chose to use what I think isn't overkill on the gamer aesthetic. There's a few adjustments from the stand. The RGB maintains a crisp, clean design approach, and it's got a tiny bit of wiggle. But overall, as a package, it's pretty sleek, and I like it. So now I'd like to show you and point out some of its main features and the experience that it's trying to offer, because for $1,700, this thing better be good. So starting with the screen, at 45 inches diagonally, it feels like your peripheral vision starts getting absorbed by the panel, and it's right at the cusp where it's not uncomfortably large, but riding on that edge. And the whole screen has a matte anti-glare finish to combat with reflections, because it does have a pretty aggressive curve, but it's not the type to completely mute the colors and contrast. Normally, the moment you use an anti-glare finish, the display is going to take a hit on brightness, contrast, and colors will appear a bit more dull. Sharpness will blur slightly, but they seem to have found a pretty okay middle ground here. Image quality wise, it doesn't completely take away from the OLED panel, but of course, there are some downsides with some of the decisions made here. And well, when I first booted this panel up, I was like, oh, either my eyes are the bottleneck here, or this thing's resolution is nowhere near anything I've been used to recently. Because with any type of high-end display, I personally expect to be able to do work and gaming on it at the same time, like desktop productivity work and gaming. So here's the thing, this monitor, while being a 240Hz OLED, receives all the positives that OLED displays have. The colors look awesome, the contrast creates an almost 3D depth effect on the image, but at the desktop, I found that going with a resolution of 3440 by 1440 at 45 inches, you end up with a pretty low pixel density, and that definitely takes a hit on sharpness, which is a little bit upsetting, like a deal breaker right out of the door for a lot of people. But okay, I'm gonna try to look at it on the bright side. The gaming experience at this lower resolution isn't as big of a deal as it is on the desktop. Sure, text still isn't really crisp, but when you're sitting at that optimal distance, you seem to focus less on the resolution and more on the immersion of the gameplay, which 240Hz with essentially instantaneous response times is fantastic. Who would have guessed? But if you pixel peek UI elements on the HUD, you can notice the areas where they look pixelated. There's more space between the pixels, and since the panel has a more aggressive curve, it requires you to sit closer to nail that optimal visual distance, making the issue even more prominent. Now on the bright side, you do maintain a 21:9 aspect ratio with this monitor, so that's going to be supported by more content types, more game developers, and you're not going to run into nearly as many UI scaling issues like you would with a 32:9 aspect ratio. The only problem is the resolution is kind of a bummer. But now the question of how well does an OLED panel translate to real-world use as a gaming monitor can finally be answered without Frankensteining a TV. So altogether, you're getting 98% P3 color accuracy, they're saying 1000 nits of peak HDR brightness, G-Sync, and FreeSync support. So I ran this through a ton of different titles, from competitive FPS shooters to cinematic story games. It's a really nice display, and honestly it feels as fast as some of the top-of-the-line IPS competitive monitors. There is as minimal ghosting as you can get with an OLED panel, and it really feels like there's nothing between you and the inputs. Now the brightness isn't as high as I'd like it to be. Keep in mind, this is just me eyeballing it versus the C2 because I'm still currently in the process of getting a proper meter to measure brightness data, but I found it a bit dim. I had to run this panel in the HDR mode and tweak the colors a bit to get it looking really good. And I had the brightness cranked to 100 all the time. So you can only dial in these settings so much, but the one thing you can't get around is resolution, right? Well, sort of. I experimented with NVIDIA's Deep Learning Dynamic Super Resolution, which is essentially another tool that can use the tensor cores on RTX cards to create fidelity enhancements. And it actually works pretty well. What's going on here is the game itself is being rendered at a higher resolution than supported by the monitor. Then it scales that down and ultimately results in a sharper looking image without a ton of performance loss. Overall, it's just a band-aid approach to tweaking this, but it can assist if you want to bump up the sharpness a bit. Bottom line, if you can get past the resolution cons, it can be an enjoyable experience to game on. Even with a 4090, I found that it was pretty tough to pull the full 240 Hz capability, but the overall visuals, the shadows and dark environments, the peak brightness of bullet tracers, and the effects along with those inky blacks and vibrant colors, OLED is awesome at bringing those rich environments to life. Where I think this display really excels at is the immersion factor. Like, this thing would be amazing for racing sims or the types of games where you want the environment to pull you in. Now the elephant in the room is burn-in. It's always gonna come up with these OLED screens. Windows static elements are gonna pose a challenge. Plus we're still running into the issue of text fringing, which is due to the lack of support for the OLED subpixel layout. It would be pretty nice to have Microsoft step it up and get on this because it's been a problem for a while now. Now, on the other hand, LG does have a variety of pixel refresh features and a sleep function built in, which, by the way, the whole monitor can be controlled with an external remote, and it's awesome. But yeah, I'd recommend hiding the taskbar, refreshing static images. Maybe this means a return for screensavers once again. My overall thoughts on this as a package is that they could have nailed it. They could have made the perfect display for a lot of people. Maybe if they made it a tad smaller, like 38 to 42 inches, bumped up the resolution a bit, and dropped the refresh rate just a little bit. I feel like that would have made a little more sense and appealed to a wider audience. I mean, when you think about this is really made for those top-of-the-line enthusiasts that are on the hunt for a top-tier gaming experience. And honestly, at the prices you can find the other 4K OLEDs from LG, it's tough to recommend this when you can pick up something like an offering from Samsung or a 42-inch C2 for like $900. So even if you don't care about any of this, the OLEDification of desktop displays should mean lower prices on IPS panels and eventually push the standard for visual fidelity in monitors. Maybe you don't pixel peak as hard as I do and you'll love this panel, but for $1,700 and already having a compromise on the resolution, yeah, it's not for everyone, but it's definitely unique. So there you go. LG's newest golden panel has its quirks. So maybe you'll love it, maybe you won't. You still gotta appreciate that the tech is finally arriving after a long journey. Thank you so much for watching. See you guys in the next one.